The auctioneer barely looked at the two yaks. Nobody else did either. They stood in the far corner of the livestock pen, their shaggy coats tangled with mud and burrs, their ribs faintly visible beneath thick black hair. One was a female. The other was a young bull. Both were undersized. Both were nervous. And according to the paperwork, neither had been worth transporting to the auction. The auctioneer sighed. Two head. As is. No hands went up. He waited. Nothing. Then 37-year-old Emily Carter raised her card. The auctioneer stared. You want both? Emily nodded. For $19? Yes. Someone in the crowd laughed. A rancher behind her muttered. You could spend $19 better at the feed store. Emily ignored him. She had spent the last year trying to find animals that could survive on her roughest acreage. Her 140-acre farm in western Montana wasn't easy land. The winters were brutal. The summers were dry. Much of the northern section was rocky, steep, and covered in brush that ordinary cattle ignored. Emily had inherited the property from her father. She couldn't afford to improve every acre. So she needed livestock that could use what was already there. And she'd been researching yaks. The two animals were loaded into her trailer. Her 11-year-old daughter, June, watched from the passenger seat. Mom, they're really ugly. Emily laughed. They're probably offended. The female stared through the trailer bars. June leaned closer. What's her name? She doesn't have one. June thought for a moment. Bruno. Emily looked at the young bull. That's the boy. Then she's Bella. Emily smiled. Bella and Bruno. The yaks arrived at the farm just before sunset. Emily opened the trailer. The animals stepped out slowly. They didn't rush. They didn't panic. They simply stood in the pasture and looked around. Then Bella lowered her head and began eating. Bruno followed. Emily watched. At least they know what to do. June nodded. They're eating weeds. Exactly. That was the first thing Emily noticed. The yaks weren't interested in the carefully planted grass near the barn. They were walking toward the roughest edge of the pasture. They ate brush, coarse grass, thistles, plants the cattle usually left behind. Emily took out her notebook. She wrote, Day 1, they eat everything. The first winter tested them. Snow covered the pasture. Temperatures dropped below zero. Emily moved the yaks into a sheltered paddock and provided hay, minerals, and unfrozen water. They handled the cold better than she expected. Their thick coats grew heavier. They stood outside while the cattle crowded into shelter. June thought they looked like walking blankets. They don't seem cold. Emily shook her head. They're built for this. By March, the farm was still buried beneath snow. Then temperatures warmed. The snow began melting. Water ran down the hillside. Emily expected mud. Instead, she noticed something unusual. The yak pasture had far less standing water than the neighboring cattle field. She walked uphill. Bella and Bruno had spent the winter moving through areas Emily had considered useless. Their grazing had opened small pathways through dense vegetation. Their hooves had disturbed patches of compacted ground. Their manure was scattered across areas that had rarely received nutrients. But the biggest surprise came in April. Green shoots appeared, not just around the barn, across the rough northern pasture. Native grasses, wildflowers, young clover, and something Emily hadn't seen there in years. Aspen seedlings. Emily called a local range specialist. Dr. Mason Reed arrived with soil testing equipment. He walked the pasture for nearly 2 hours. Then he crouched and examined the ground. What have you been doing here? Emily pointed toward the yaks. Those two. Mason laughed. I'm serious. So am I. He looked at Bella and Bruno. They've been grazing this all winter. Mason shook his head. That's interesting. Emily smiled. People keep saying that. The soil tests revealed something even more surprising. The northern pasture had extremely low organic matter in several sections. But areas regularly used by the yaks showed improvement. Their grazing had reduced some aggressive brush. Their manure had redistributed nutrients. Their movement had created small patches where new plants could establish. They hadn't magically fertilized the land, but they had changed how the vegetation was being used. Emily began experimenting. Instead of allowing the yaks to wander everywhere, she used temporary fencing. She created small grazing zones. The animals spent a limited time in each section. Then Emily moved them. The pasture rested, and the spring growth continued. By May, the northern hillside looked different. From the farmhouse porch, Emily could see green spreading across the slope. June ran outside one morning. Mom, Emily followed. June pointed toward the field. Look, dozens of tiny white flowers had appeared among the grass. Bees moved between them. Butterflies fluttered over the hillside. Emily smiled. That's new. Did the Yaks do that? Emily looked toward Bella. Maybe they helped. Then the county drought committee came to inspect local farms. That spring had been unusually dry. Most ranchers were already worried. Emily expected her northern pasture to struggle. Instead, it remained green. Not perfectly, but noticeably greener than the exposed fields nearby. The county agricultural agent walked the hillside. He looked at the vegetation, then at the Yaks, then back at Emily. You said these animals cost you $19? Emily nodded. He laughed. I've spent more than that on lunch. Emily smiled. They're earning their keep. Word spread quickly. Neighboring ranchers began visiting. Some laughed. Others became curious. One asked if Yaks could really eat brush. Another asked whether they could survive winter. A third wanted to know why Emily wasn't simply raising cattle. Emily didn't have all the answers, but she had records. She had measured pasture growth, tracked rainfall, recorded grazing dates, compared soil samples, and photographed the same hillside every month. The evidence was beginning to tell a story, but the biggest test hadn't arrived yet, because the first spring had revealed something. And by early summer, Emily discovered that Bella wasn't just eating the land. She was preparing to change the herd. Emily didn't understand what the county agent meant until the following morning. Bella was standing alone near the far fence. She was noticeably heavier, not bloated, pregnant. Emily walked closer and stared. June followed. Mom. Emily smiled. Looks like we're going to have a calf. June's eyes widened. A baby yak? That's what it looks like. Bruno stood several yards away, chewing calmly as if nothing unusual had happened. The pregnancy changed Emily's plans. She had purchased 2 unwanted yaks for $19. Now she had the possibility of building a small herd. But Emily wasn't interested in expanding simply because she could. She wanted to see whether the animals could actually thrive on her land. Bella's pregnancy was carefully monitored. Emily increased her nutrition. Dr. Mason recommended a veterinary examination. The veterinarian confirmed that Bella was healthy and progressing normally. Then came June. Mom, how much will the baby cost? Emily laughed. Hopefully less than the $19. June grinned. Then we'll be rich. Emily shook her head. Let's keep it alive first. The calf arrived in early summer. It was a tiny, shaggy creature with long legs and a thick dark coat. Bella cleaned it immediately. Within minutes, the calf struggled upright. June watched from behind the fence, practically bouncing with excitement. It's standing. Emily smiled. Strong little thing. Bruno approached cautiously. The calf wobbled toward him. For several seconds, the young bull simply stared. Then he lowered his enormous head and sniffed the calf. Emily laughed. Looks like he's been promoted. The calf changed the farm. Emily now had 3 yaks. More importantly, she had proof that the animals could reproduce successfully under her management. She began studying their grazing behavior even more carefully. The yaks were remarkably efficient on rough ground. They preferred coarse vegetation. They traveled easily across rocky slopes. And they didn't seem interested in stripping the pasture completely bare. Emily adjusted her rotation plan. She put the yaks into sections where brush and mature vegetation had accumulated. Then she moved them before the ground became overgrazed. The results were striking. By late summer, the northern pasture looked nothing like it had the year before. The thick brush had opened. Native grasses covered the soil. Wildflowers had multiplied. The aspen seedlings were surviving. Bees and butterflies filled the flowering areas. The soil beneath the vegetation remained cooler and moister than the exposed ground. Emily wasn't claiming the yaks had created an ecological miracle. They had simply become the right animals for land that conventional cattle hadn't been using efficiently. Then came the drought. Rainfall dropped dramatically. Neighboring ranchers began supplementing their cattle with hay. Some sold animals. Emily prepared for the worst. She reduced her grazing pressure, moved the yaks more carefully, and protected the most vulnerable areas. The rough northern pasture, however, continued producing. The yaks found enough coarse forage to maintain themselves. The cattle on the lower fields needed more assistance. Emily began to see the bigger picture. She didn't need every acre to produce the same thing. She needed each acre used appropriately. In August, the county agricultural department organized a pasture field day. More than 30 ranchers arrived. Emily walked them through the northern pasture. She showed them her grazing records, rainfall measurements, before and after photographs, soil tests, plant surveys. Then she pointed toward Bella, Bruno, and their growing calf. The animals aren't magic, she said. They're tools. One rancher asked. Why yaks? Emily answered honestly. Because they use forage my cattle don't use as well. Another asked. Would this work everywhere? No. That surprised them. Emily continued. Every farm is different. The point isn't to copy me. The point is to understand what your land produces and choose animals that fit it. The group became quiet. For the first time, nobody was laughing. The rancher who had mocked Emily at the auction eventually visited. He stood beside the fence watching Bella graze. I remember telling you $19 was too much. Emily smiled. You were concerned. I was wrong. He looked across the hillside. How much would you sell her for now? Emily laughed. She's not for sale. He nodded. I figured. By the second spring, the transformation was undeniable. The northern hillside greened earlier. Water infiltrated more easily. The pasture held moisture longer. Native plants returned. And the yak herd had grown. Bella was healthy. Bruno had matured. Their first calf was thriving. Emily had also added another carefully selected female from a nearby breeder. She wasn't trying to become a huge operation. She wanted a small herd suited specifically to the difficult portions of her farm. The $19 experiment had become a management strategy. The county eventually used Emily's farm as a demonstration site for diversified grazing. Not because yaks were a miracle animal. Because Emily had demonstrated something many farmers forgot. The best livestock isn't always the livestock everyone else is raising. Sometimes an animal that looks useless in one system becomes valuable in another. The two yaks had cost $19 because almost nobody wanted them. But Emily hadn't purchased them for their auction value. She purchased them for what they could do on land other cattle struggled to use. One evening, June sat on the porch beside her mother. The free yaks grazed on the distant hillside. The calf had grown considerably. Its shaggy coat glowed in the setting sun. June looked at her mother. Do you remember when everyone laughed? Emily smiled. Very clearly. They thought you were crazy. They weren't completely wrong. June laughed. Would you buy them again? Emily looked toward Bella. Then Bruno. Then the young calf. Absolutely. She paused. But not because they were cheap. Why then? Emily looked across the green hillside. Because they belonged there. The next morning, Emily walked through the pasture. The first spring had shocked the county. The second spring confirmed it. The land was not suddenly perfect. There were still dry years. Still weeds. Still fencing to repair. Still work to do. But the northern pasture had become more productive and more diverse than it had been in years. And the two animals nobody wanted had helped Emily discover a better way to use it. The original $19 purchase had produced a calf. The calf had become part of a growing herd. The herd had helped manage neglected ground. And the restored pasture had become one of the healthiest parts of the farm. Emily stopped at the fence and watched Bella grazing beneath the morning sun. She remembered the auctioneer's bored voice. 2 head. Asses. $19. At the time, everyone had thought she was buying 2 useless animals. They had missed the real bargain. Emily hadn't bought yaks. She had bought a possibility. And when spring arrived, the land finally showed everyone what that possibility was worth.